それじゃあこれからちょっとパネル。
So we're going to have a panel discussion. Wow, looks like, or feels like we traveled over a period of 1,000 years. Pacific Islands are close to us, but here in Japan, we don't pay much attention to them very often. It's expansive, it has long history, and visual culture, very rich. It's something that I learned, at least. So I'm supposed to be a moderator. I'm not going to ask question answer. I'm not going to have a one-on-one. So maybe you can each ask each other questions, and I'll just be a facilitator for that. Shigematsu-san, any thoughts?
I was set up by Nanjo-san to be paired with you because, you both sounded like a very, the whole presentation sounded like a poetry itself. Mine sounded like I don't know what, but anyway, I really enjoyed it, and I didn't understand though, like what your take on the contemporary change. I know your ambition to it, but I didn't really get the feeling what's exactly happening in those both cities, both areas, in Polynesian and also in Indonesia. You touched a little bit, but what is the kind of dramatic change? Is there a debate that is going on to look at their, origins because there's a development, or it's just you're just saying that's part of the history and we just have to respect?
For me, or for the Pacific Islands, I think there are a lot of debates going on with current construction models and design elements, particularly because of the impact on the environments on some small islands or even in the larger islands like Papua New Guinea. For me, I raised a lot of comments and looked to the past because those designs are reminders to pay attention to your ecological environment. And it's about ecological intelligence, which I loved that term. So it's not a possibility, I don't think, to avoid modern constructions and architecture, imported materials, but I think there can be a meeting place, and I think that ancient or traditional knowledge can be integrated into modern design.
Well, in the case of Indonesia, I think it is quite interesting to look at how the process of modernizations has been constructing our contemporary life, because most of it is because of politics and power struggle. Let's say, for example, in around 1965, where there are huge shifting in political life in Indonesia, I just recently learned how Indonesian governments is systematically try to introduce the new way of farming to most of traditional farmers by using power. And for me, somehow this new approach on farming, some of it is good, but I think not everything is perfect. And it is the disciplines of ancient farming practice is somehow becoming a huge problems, because I think recently there are a lot of researchers who are somehow started to realize that this ancient concept of farming somehow already find a balance connections in between food productions and the ecological situations, to see the connections in between certain activities on star constellations or certain dynamics of insects reproductions and something like that. And it's somehow it fit in with this new approach on permaculture, for example. And I didn't see there are these conflicting interests between traditional and modern technique of farming, but I think with to find this common ground, how to connect the traditional and ancestral practice with this modern concept of farming, I think both can give us improvements for future food productions. So in that sense, I think now within this new knowledge and new understanding on traditional food productions, I see this glimpse of way out, because in the past, what is being considered as modern and traditional is always in this in oppositions. But now I see that more people can have more understanding that both traditional and modern way is somehow have this common interest to find solutions somehow.
And I'd like to kind of turn the question back to you, Shohei. And with your project in Hawaii, how are you going? I guess I see the need for reconsidering food production in Hawaii as that confrontation with modern practices, right? And they've been importing everything for so long, and the environmental impact that has. So I guess I'd put it to you, what do you see as you're beginning this project in Hawaii as the issues, and then where are you looking for these models towards sustainable futures?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because Hawaii also has the same system of the land ownership, as you know. The Hawaiians own the land and they subdivide into strips, and that strip actually goes from the top of the mountain to the ocean. So they have a notion that the land ownership extends quite far out. So that was the reason that we thought it was quite natural to respect that ownership in the sense of land on their side, to really do a farming not only on the mountains where it's already quite exploited and contaminated, but ocean still has a chance to actually be the part of food production. So we actually have one Hawaiian, advisor who is really telling us how the landowner system works, and then according to that system, how we are allocating those food production. So it's not really a kind of traditional versus modern in terms of technique, but it's just a kind of mental level we're trying to respect.
And I think for me, for what I was trying to get at, that meeting that I think is so important. The example I raised of the bull in Palau, it's enacted by the community, but it's a temporary restrictions on fishing or something, but it can be used in a modern sense, and it's respected, right? It doesn't have to be written as law, but it's understood because it's based in the community and cultural knowledge, whereas the way that you're looking at land divisions and sharing in Hawaii I see as also respect of the customary and ancient.
Yeah. But going back to your tradition versus contemporary, I'm also working with IRRI, which is one of the best. They have a best gene bank of rice. It's located in the outskirts of Philippines, in Manila. So what's interesting is that they're, of course, one of the most hated entity, because they genetically modify also rice to increase the production. But they also have the biggest collection of rice species, about 2,000. But they are talking that in order to create a best genetically modified rice to sustain the food production to feed the entire planet, because as you know, 50% of staple food in the world is rice. So they somehow have this kind of notion that it has to keep the diversity in order to create the monoculture of very efficient food. What do you think of this kind of, the different scale? Because it sounded like, it was a little bit vague how you described about tradition versus
Well,
modern.
what is also quite interesting case in terms of the introductions of new breeds of rice is that starting from the 60s, most of traditional farmer in Indonesia is somehow being pushed to plant a more hybrid and genetically modified rice. But in the same time, the new problem appears because the local knowledge how to grow and develop local rice that are suitable with the local environment is somehow becoming disappear. And more farmer doesn't know now how to grow the specific rice for specific locations. Like for example, I think the center of rice research is located in Philippines, but most of the time I think what is quite interesting in Kasapuan Ciptagelar village is that they grew their own rice. So somehow they find out how to grow specific rice for specific location and specific heights. So up until now, at least farmers in Kasapuan Ciptagelar have been successful in developing around 200 variety of rice for very, very specific locations of rice plants.
But now people are saying it's actually already being done, like in Media Lab, that you can that's a terroir, like champagne can only come from Champagne, but actually you can really now analyze the actual the construct and then actually reproduce that anywhere, like So.
Yeah, well, I think most of the thing that we have forgot is that in the city we might doesn't have any problem when the food is being produced. But for those who are living in the rural areas or even in the remote village, the localized food production system is somehow strongly needed. And I think the homogeneous approach on food productions is somehow threatening these conditions. And now I think we need some new approach how to allow local solutions to grow. But I think for example, last month there is this interesting conference on food productions in Eindhoven, and there's this researcher think that the only solutions to feed the world need for food is to bring all corporations to developing countries, in which for me is like, maybe that is not a good idea, maybe, I don't know. But I think to allow people to still access the knowledge and practicing the culture is pretty much the essence of the solutions. I didn't say that the modern way is not correct, but somehow we need some more localized solutions in that.
I think it is also how much you control the things, right?
Yeah.
Because naturally you had a knowledge, historical, cultural knowledge. On the other hand, now we have scientific knowledge, technology, and then which way you go, but there's no right answer maybe, and whether we should let it be, and which one survives. For example, the rice made by technology, maybe kind of designed rice, or maybe natural grown rice, which can actually survive in the long run in this cultural milieu and this culture of society and the system of economy. Which one can survive better? In a sense, it's like that. Also, there's a big issue for Pacific Island countries that ecological situation, how do you say, the global warming is a big issue. And this is very difficult to control, I guess, but how the situation is it?
Well, it's a huge issue, and I was thinking of the images Shohei showed of actually growing out in the water, because with this loss of land because of environmental impact, sea level rise, communities have to leave their home, and if they're able to actually grow out on the ocean, it may enable them to stay on that land longer. And because if it's not, even if the agricultural land is contaminated, if they have growing systems that go out into their ocean, onto their track of ocean, right, then that will be a way to keep those important connections to land and where you are and where your ancestors have been. So I think these aspects of technology are essential in this age of climate change, because some communities are being faced to leave.
So in such a situation, what architecture can do is also a big question.
Yeah, architecture is a little bit more severe on the technique versus the tradition, because obviously traditional technique still needs to be preserved and maintained, and architecture preservation is also becoming one of the regime that is as strong as development. So the preservation and development is almost becoming like a similar level of regime, like because of the UNESCO World Heritage Site, etc., that also spawns another economy of itself. But like the technique, of course, the architecture, manufacturing is basically subtraction manufacturing, but like 3D printer is additive, and you have no waste. Well, that's what they say. But if that becomes a true usable technology for architecture, then I think the notion of complexity, simplicity, speed, economy all changes. So I think it could be a very disruptive moment. Maybe, I don't know how soon that will come.
On one side, there are many assets of historical buildings. On the other hand, we should challenge new ideas, new technology, new buildings. And this balance is again very important, I guess. But at the same time, some countries are disappearing. In front of those situations, I mean, kind of a fact or reality, also the responsibility and question of architecture is much more, it's a kind of huge, isn't it, for the people to survive in such a country. Maybe technology can solve some problems, but maybe they cannot.
Well, I think in some certain extent, even technology or new technique on architecture is mostly also based on this ancient and traditional knowledge, which is being developed for very, very long periods of time. So I didn't see that finding new solutions and approach in answering current challenge and complexity is going to ruin the knowledge. But I think the problem is that we have to enrich the knowledge in order to face our current challenge and situations. And in that sense, I think it's quite interesting to see Shohei's presentations on these islands and sea architectural system, because I think within this new global climate change, the sea level will keep on rising, and we certainly need to find new approach and solutions to facing that challenge. Because based on a lot of stories that are being told by the elders, what we have been experienced today is already happens for several times in the past. Like the rise of sea levels also happens like 10,000 years ago, and we're going to maybe experience it again. And I think that is also why the boat and the house is like a strong metaphors in the Pacific, because maybe something that happens in the past is making that symbols is becoming very important, and maybe for the future, the house and the boat is going to be another, going to have these very strong functions. And what Shohei-san mentions during his presentation for me is like maybe this is also one of the key solutions to that.
There is a knowledge of the past, but there is a new technology. What is the criteria to choose which way to go?
That is a very hard question to answer.
Is it for
I'm by
survival?
no means an expert, but I think it's finding the meeting places, right? It shouldn't be a choice of one or the other, but it's paying attention to both and thinking about ecology and history when making new architectures and when implementing new technologies. So that, again, I love this term, ecological intelligence, that new technologies are appropriate for the place and are adapted as necessary, when necessary. I think of, again, going back to this great example of the growing gardens and the ocean or growing food. That's in turn going to make us more conscious of runoff, right? And other things that are happening on the land. So the benefits of that are great. And so this new technology comes back and affects the land in many positive ways.
What do you think?
I think the true tradition can endure also a technological injection. So, something traditional doesn't mean that you can implement something new. That's my understanding of actual tradition. But if it's preservation, that's a different story. You preserve something without any new forward-looking in your mind. But so
When you design your how to say, your work, your products, your architecture, do you consciously try to pay attention to the traditional things?
sometimes, like, we research a lot to the level that all the knowledge becomes abstract, so not really trying to refer to it like postmodernism, but we obviously should know the history and the cultural background of each building. But the building life cycle of building is a very interesting issue, because nowadays American institutions really in the contract say this building has to be 100 years old or 200 years old, 200 years compatible to remain. I mean, but as you know, the lifespan of the building is a lot to do with people who use this and people who's trying to preserve
You
it.
mean the architect has to sign on such a contract?
Yeah.
Oh.
That's what. Well, luckily, I don't have to.
Yeah.
I don't have to
Particularly
witness
like in
that.
Japan, we have an earthquake and tsunami.
Yeah, Japan has very different,
Yeah.
notion to the ephemeral, the building's physical nature. Yes.
Catherine, I saw the image of the museum in where it's by Renzo Piano. What is it? It's a very big pillars standing, and it's a very unique shape.
It's the museum, the cultural center, is a series of buildings that have different topics or themes within them, but they're inspired by the traditional hut structure that comes up and is rounded at the top. So Piano took inspiration from those designs and also made it hybrid to also kind of have the effect of the tall trees that are all around it. So really focusing on environment, right, and ecology, and hoping that the buildings merge into that landscape.
Shigematsu, did you know that building by Renzo Piano?
Yeah, I haven't been there, but I knew the design. Looks nice.
In Indonesia, how the new architectures, are they trying to be very modern or trying to absorb the tradition?
I think in the past couple of years, there are this new wave of architect and designers who are starting to adopt these ideas on integrating many elements in their works. And I know there's these particular projects that combining hotels with place for farmers, so they grow their own vegetables in the hotel. For me, it's like, wow, this is quite interesting ideas. Well, it's not that big idea. It's only a small seed of examples. But for me, yeah, it resembles this new interest among many people to combining different ideas and complexities into proposed solutions. Well, I don't know whether it works or not in the long run, but somehow these new intentions is reflecting, I think, the common interests that are started to appear and visualize somehow. And yeah, one of the main challenges, again, I think this longing for immortality. Like, yeah, our modern society seems to wanting to live longer than its usual. Like, if something has to be destroyed and disappear, I think that is also one of the natural cycle, right? And yeah, that's also our problem in our time. Yeah.
In Indonesia, I have some friend who are talking about art history, and he was often saying that the modernization of art, the modernism, was originally it was supposed to be one thing, modern, to become modern, but in Indonesia, the modernism is different from the West. And at the end, the modernism is all different. So it is contradictory because modernism is more universal idea, but actually what we apply at the site as a practice, it's all different. So there are hundreds of modernism.
Yeah.
And that's quite, well, for me, it came from Indonesia.
Well, yeah, this complex understanding upon a history or a history of modernizations in Indonesia is also, I think, is going to become more challenging from time to time, because even the term Indonesia itself is not easy to understand from the single perspective, because you have to be specific which part of Indonesia that you are talking about, because there are around 7,000 islands in Indonesia, and then there are probably a different perspective of Indonesia as a country or as a nation state. And I think, but in general, the main narrative of Indonesian modernity is mostly imposed by political shift rather than cultural. So in that sense, there are these always dualism and contradictions, that we understand Indonesia as a concept of nation state, but in the same time, Indonesia is like the continuations of this post-colonial history, where local cultures and identity is also in the process of ongoing struggle somehow. So to understand modernization in Indonesia, I think not only look at the history, but also look how the islands and geodynamics in the regions happens, because the most of islands seems to become more alive at this moment, especially after the tsunami in 2005. So there is always a shifting in the earth. Like there is even this interesting terminology in Indonesia on islands in Nias, on the Mentawaians. They call islands as a living being. So there is always shifting, changing dynamics in between islands, and we never knew whether in the next 100 years there will be under Indonesia that we understand today or not. Even like in Bandung, we have this rupture that are moving like 1 centimeters a year, because the earth is keep on moving and keep on changing. So in general, maybe that's the landscape of Indonesia, that is ongoing change and shifting that are happens.
Katherine, would you like to add something to that?
I think it's very much the same concepts in the Pacific Islands, and I think, Gustaff, you were mentioning in your presentation about a lot of the knowledge is paired with poetry or songs, and similarly in the Pacific Islands, there's that pairing with oral histories that the islands, have always been moving, and they were pulled up by spirits which is all a reflection of actual science, you know, and tectonic movements. So these moving islands, it's a part of our contemporary modern lives, and anywhere, you know, whether it's Japan or Indonesia,
Japan, like
this, you know, the environment is shifting, changing, moving all of our locations.
I was actually very fascinated by your initial statement that maybe Japan actually belongs to the Pacific rather than the continent. I mean, in that way, like the big issue about TPP. But what I like about the concept is that the countries that shares the ocean is the one unity rather than the land. So I was just curious, like how I wanted to ask how they see Japan in the context of that kind of similarity and difference.
A few months before I joining this forum, I learned that recently there are also some research finding that saying there are common connections in between Japan and the rest of Pacific islands, especially around the era of Jomon Japan. Like I think that is quite interesting to see how farming practice in southern part of Japan is somehow similar with farmer in Java Island, for example. We still using the same star clusters, for example. And just this morning, I see on televisions that in southern part of Japan, they also use the same technique of drying the rice. For me, it's like, wow, this is interesting. How the knowledge is being distributed in the very vast area. For me, it's quite interesting to see how similarities and differences is somehow interconnect with each other.
Katherine, how Japan looks from your point of view?
I think from the point of view of, you know, the Pacific Islands, I think Japan is very much connected in terms of the issues that are faced around the Pacific Ocean. I think because a number of the Pacific Islands are very small on land, not on ocean, but on land, that may be aligning themselves as Pacific Islands, excluding places like Japan or in some cases Indonesia, Australia, is important because there's different issues that they're facing. But I think in terms of the shared history, there are always connections, and you know, the routes that I showed were more from the Philippines and Taiwan, but it was to show there is that connection, and through navigation and this technology, there are connections and routes around all the islands.
Anything to add?
Now I'd like to open the questions for the floor. If
you have any questions, please identify to whom you're addressing your question before you start. Any questions? Yes, Pai. You are raising in the forefront.
Thank you for the wonderful presentations. My question is mainly presented to Shohei. I'm really interested in the context of the research, or whether these are real projects that perhaps also you talked about Hawaii. And the reason I'm curious is that maybe it's myself, but I think we really don't know that well about the architecture of food production, distribution, and consumption. And it is, of course, obviously an extremely important global issue and problem. And one thing that I think was lacking, perhaps in the whole presentation is the context of the mechanization and globalization production system, of the modernization. And you know, people like, within the architectural world, people like Caroline Steele, who is based in the UK, has done research centered on UK about how modern phenomena of production is a very dangerous thing that is global, how Tesco dominates food distribution and production, and the dangers of mechanization and monopolization. The mad cow, of course, which comes from the UK, springs from that kind of issue. And so when you're doing your research or work, I think obviously you are trying to do the architecture of food in a different way from this modern method. And so I've never met an architect of a slaughterhouse. I don't. There probably is somebody who is an expert on designing slaughterhouses and the way the meat is packed and distributed. But I would think that you're trying to sort of overcome that you're trying to find a new model of the architecture of food.
No. Actually, I didn't show you today, but we also researched the history of broiler house, where you raise chickens. It's actually very, very interesting. It used to be a kind of linear one with the big vents at both ends and some on the sides too. Basically, it's an entire room is duct to circulate the air as much as possible for the chickens. But then now it's becoming more and more industrial, and as you know, it's a horrible thing to see. After you see those, you don't want to eat chickens anymore. But there's a counter movement of the local food and organic food and also grass-fed or all that, I don't know if it's a kind of lip service or marketing strategy, but I know that those things are also started to change. But so I'm totally aware of the global, the giants of food industry, which also dictates, I think, quite a large amount of farmlands, for example, in the United States.
So my question to you is that could you give an example, whether it was Hawaii or that how can a project actually be, I don't imagine that Tesco would ask you, we want to sort of improve our food distribution system. So think of a new architectural system.
Yeah.
So
but there's one project that we successfully approached, the Walmart, is that they have they are now going to Mexico a lot from Arizona, and they're making a lot of Walmart in Mexico, but the food is still coming from the United States or vice versa. So some food are coming from Mexico to US, US to Mexico. But because of the border protections, heavy queue, a lot of food are wasted there. So like 1/3 of the food that gets exported from Mexico to US gets wasted at the border. So we've suggested to Walmart that there's a kind of a free zone already in Arizona that Mexicans can actually enter the United States without passport. So we proposed a venue that is recycling, but also some kind of extraterritorial zone that is a kind of mega Walmart, but also recycling and a recycling venue. And they are very interested. So we are talking to these people by showing these kind of potentials, and you never know if it's gonna really happen, but we are trying to deal with the real issues, not the kind of academic issues.
So Walmart is a potential client, for example.
Yeah.
Okay.
You remember that 2 days ago, the Orangcats showed some slides, images, and one of the slides was showing the very old inside of a slaughterhouse. And it looks already very mechanical, systematic way of killing animals and putting meat in the boxes. I was very struck by that, but it was maybe early 20s, I guess.
Yeah, there are a lot of architectural typologies that you'd never see, like data center and slaughterhouse. And I think there are people who are actually documenting those, like refrigeration system, actually Jeff's partner, but they basically, there are a lot of big refrigerators just to keep the, bananas, green. So that's embedded in the landscape of the United States and huge, but you never see it because sometimes it's submerged or sometimes it's just hidden. But we're trying to catalog those, and we're trying to also make a book about it.
他に質問ありませんか？
Any other questions? Yes, extreme end over there.
One very interested sessions. I'm from Hokkaido. Do you know Hokkaido? Hokkaido is a very huge potential. Hokkaido have a very huge potential. Hokkaido's food self-sufficiency rate is more over 150, sometimes 200%. So I think very interesting things. So I think most important things is how we coexist to traditional cultures and design and the traditional food system, and with new technology, new science, I think. So what do you think, you guys, how we can coexist to traditional system and the new technologies and new science?
But we talked about that already, no?
Yeah.
And
But what is the Hokkaido part, maybe? Is there a tradition?
Yeah, すみません、ちょっと日本語で。
Well, I'd like to switch to Japanese. I'm from Hokkaido. Hokkaido, perhaps Katherine knows that there is an indigenous people called Ainu with a lot of traditional methodologies and techniques, and there has been a lot of them remaining. But with the modern era, a lot of them have been vanished, eradicated, or exploited. But we would like to establish a coexistence between that tradition of indigenous people of Hokkaido and modern technology and the science. So what is the key factor allowing such coexistence to materialize? That's my question. We know that the technology science are developing, and what is the key to make sure that this coexistence happen? I would like to ask to each.
Like Shohei, working with communities, right? And you have a Hawaiian guiding you and telling you about the histories. And I think that's where the meeting is, right? So architecture design involving communities, local communities, so that they have a voice in the designs and so that the design reflects the needs, aspirations, and histories and future of that community. So in an abstract way, that's what I can offer.
But as I was trying to show in the bento box, I mean, that bento box is not just a local trend. It happens throughout the modernization, that the modernization somehow didn't respect certain, sensitive, aspect of the local culture and community sometimes. So I guess we are at the age that we can look at it again and rethink how our city, living environment could be shaped. So it's also up to you.
Yeah, well, I don't want to over-romanticize traditional and indigenous knowledge and culture, but in the same time, I think like not all things that came from the past or from our contemporary life is good for the future. So I think we have to be a bit critical and carefully looking at that, because, like for example, in the village where I'm working at, they still have this strong interest to keep and maintaining their ancestral traditions, but in the same time, the people in the village is pretty much open to applying new technologies, and they explore technologies in very strange way for me. Like in this, they do also hacking in practical level. Like my experience that these elders in the village who have the skills in developing certain tools through electronic kits, for example. They hack the broken CD-ROM and make laser cutting so they can make letter craft out of that. For me, it's like, oh, this is very interesting way in applying technology for local needs. But yeah, I also read some articles about the Ainu, which is quite interesting because there are some similarities with indigenous culture in Sundanese area. So again, there is always a connection, a common understanding of reality. And again, I always try to see the past and indigenous culture in very careful and critical, because in the same way when we see new technology, I think it is important to see it in a critical and reflective way, how to use new technology to solve our today's problems.
僕は逆にこの非常に難しい
I would say, conversely, I would like to ask a question, a challenge, because you have asked us this challenging question. Well, when we look at the tradition from an anthropological perspective, and we can also look at the contemporary world through the same lens, this has been quite an established methodology already so far. And I was invited to be on the same panel with my two co-panelists. I was wondering what would be the topic of the discussion. And this perspective, do you think, Nanjo-san, that this is an important viewpoint in art, design, and architecture? I wouldn't say really important. I haven't invited your two co-panelists because of their ethnological knowledge or interest, because I wanted to hear Katherine because she has another perspective to look at the locations. Like we said at the outset, when we ask where is Japan, it could be totally another location than in Asia, as opposed to what we say usually. And with Gustaff, you mentioned the constellations, which is a totally different perspective for us when we think about the farming activities, farming practices. So you allowed us to understand that your tradition in Indonesia could utilize the knowledge about the constellations and stars to design the farming production. So the point I wanted to make here is, with all these panelists, is to come up with another viewpoint to look at the cities, which are perhaps not urban cities, but it's not ethnological cities. And Shohei, you're in the same context. In one of the slides that you have shown, the displays and the arrangement of the buildings was based on the logistics and the distribution of the food and the consumption of the food. So the question here fundamentally is, what should be the starting point of the architecture and design for us now? Thank you. Well, it is almost time to conclude this session. I would have liked to allow and accept some more questions, but there is a lunch plan for the panelists, so we need to end the session. Thank you very much.